Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I am super excited about today's episode for two big reasons. One is that Billie has become a good friend of mine online. We've never met in person. We both live in Ontario, Canada, and we've connected through multiple projects, and we have some new collaborations coming up as well, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And I just really appreciate how much Billie is showing up in the health and wellness space, and also not being afraid to speak up and really shake things up and be a rebel in a great way. Also, because this topic is really one that, is very close to my heart as a yoga teacher, how we can make yoga more inclusive. I've been in some weird, awkward yoga classes where all of a sudden some teacher is talking to me about what I should or shouldn't eat, or saying things that make me feel shame about my body or what I might have eaten over Thanksgiving or the holidays. And it's a moment that feels really uncomfortable. It's a moment that reminds me that we all can say things at times as yoga teachers, and we can't really know until we've unlearned and learned, learn, unlearn. We just keep doing it. And that's what today's podcast is going to be about. We're going to hang out together, chat, learn together. And if you are wanting to learn more, make sure to also connect with Billie. Invite Billie in to work in your yoga teacher training spaces, or to host a workshop in your studio, or join one of their upcoming workshops on how to make yoga more inclusive, especially around anti-diet work. Okay, so if you're brand new here, let me introduce myself in the podcast before we get in further. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also called the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. I'm a yoga teacher. I'm a mom of 3. I'm an entrepreneur and forever student who has so many questions. Way more questions than answers. And I like that. I feel like it's a good spot to be. That's why podcasting is a good fit for me. I get to ask a lot of questions, and I love that we can hang out and learn together as yoga professionals. This podcast was made for you, the yoga teacher, because I know the feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm leaving yoga teacher training, that security, that community, that place of learning, and I'm now taking this out into the world. And sometimes there's so much information in a training that we have, and we're like, oh my gosh, I have to bring this all into class. Or sometimes the business side of running a yoga business is so overwhelming that it can feel really isolating. Being an entrepreneur can feel really isolating. And so I wanted yoga teachers to have a place where they could connect for free to other yoga teachers, to information, to ideas, to this supportive community. And so that's how the podcast came about. Returning listeners, you know that already. Thanks for being here again and again, supporting the podcast. That means so much. Speaking of supporting the podcast, OfferingTree is a software that I use and love in my own business because it automates everything when I want to put an offering online, like the bookings, the payments, the Zoom links, the reminders, and so much more. And they also bring this podcast today to your ears. They're footing the bill for all of the work that goes into creating a podcast. We have a podcast editor. Sinead is our community manager. Crunch writes the show notes. We have a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and OfferingTree makes this possible. They also take care of our listeners because we have a special podcast listener discount code for you. If you want to check them out and use the software to build your website, to do your bookings, your payments, all the things, that's over at OfferingTree.com/Shannon. Another thing I want to tell you about is that today's episode is also brought to you by my 20-hour Yoga for Pelvic Health Training. It's an online training that I led live. It's all pre-recorded now, so you can do it at your own pace. And this is all of the information that I have learned as a pelvic health professional and yoga teacher, and it's all combined into a training for you. You can join. I love to teach in a way that's like, here's the information, here's the theory behind it, and now let's do the practice and like land it in our bodies. And then let's come back for questions and more learning. And that's the way that's done. I'm really excited about that training. Anyone who takes it tells me how fantastic it is. And you can still sign up for it. So to find that, go to theconnectedyogateacher.com, look under training, and there's a 20-hour Yoga for Pelvic Health training there. And if you're like, gosh, I don't have 20 hours, Shannon, there's also a 3-hour training if you're like, I need to invest a little less time, a little less money, and maybe check this out first and go ahead and choose which one fits your schedule and your budget. All right, let's get into today's interview. So, making yoga spaces more inclusive is something we've talked about on the podcast in several episodes. This lights me up because, we think, well, yoga's for everyone. Well, yeah, let's make sure that people are feeling that, when they walk into a yoga class. Let's make sure that it is actually inclusive. And I'm learning how to do that right alongside you, connected yoga teachers. So we did an episode with Gabby Parkham back in episode 265, Teach LGBTQIA plus inclusive yoga. That's a great episode to have a listen to. Also, 199, we talked with Erin about creating inclusive yoga spaces. Episode 108, I talked about inclusive language for prenatal yoga because some of our listeners were saying to me, hey, Shannon, this language doesn't feel inclusive. And so I started learning, unlearning, and sharing that with all of you. And you can check out a full list of this in our anti-oppression, inclusion, and accessibility in yoga podcasts and articles resource page. This page is thanks to Crunch. Crunch had this idea of like, let's put all the podcasts that are like this in one place so that people can search there. I'm so grateful for the team over here. I just want to say that. I'm going to say it near the end of today's episode, but my goodness, they really see what would help our connected yoga teachers. And so I'll make sure to include all of this in the show notes, which is over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/381. So if you have a listen to today's episode and you're like, gosh, I want to learn more about this, or maybe you're putting a workshop together or a training and you want to make sure that you are making it inclusive, go have a listen to these episodes. Today, we're going to zoom in and talk about making movement more accessible by adopting a different approach to yoga poses instead of this one-size-fits-all. And we're really going to talk about anti-diet, queer-affirming spaces, and I'm so glad that Billie Smith is the one joining us to talk about all of this. I shared an email from Billie on the podcast some time ago. You can check out that episode. It was episode 369, Struggling to Write Content is Normal with Billie Smith. Oh my gosh, I got this email from Billie and thought, this needs to be a podcast episode. And I suggested it to them and they were like, they did it. And we shared it on the podcast. And it's one that I'm so grateful for. Billie is one of those yoga teachers, entrepreneurs, and humans that is like living it and able to share, like, here's what's going on in real time. And I appreciate that so much because, gosh, we're all feeling that way. We're all feeling like, oh my gosh, I am struggling to write an email right now or create some content. Now, before we dive in and meet Billie, I'd like to dig into a couple of episodes. I want to talk about a couple of episodes where we were talking about removing diet culture from our yoga spaces. So episode 307, we talked with Diane Finlayson, taking diet culture out of Ayurveda. And also episode 292, we talked with Jessica and Alyssa about taking diet culture out of yoga. And so I'll link to those as well. This is one of those topics where I keep learning and unlearning. And gosh, it's made a difference, not only like when I'm in a yoga space and how I talk to other humans, but this makes a difference in my day-to-day life, like how I talk to anyone. And I pick up on the quote unquote normal things that are being said to us about the food that we are taking into our bodies and also about our bodies. There's so much commentary happening about our bodies, especially in yoga spaces. So everything is linked in the show notes. And now let's get into talking with Billie. So if you don't know them already, Billie is a queer yoga movement teacher, trauma abuse survivor who's disrupting the norm and going against the grain. They are dedicated to eliminating diet culture, spiritual bypassing, and other excluding narratives from the yoga spaces they create. They help their students to learn to check in with how they feel instead of how they look. Through group classes, one-on-one sessions, and workshops, Billie leads with an open heart and strives to hold safe, inclusive space for folks seeking to move their bodies for emotional health, to increase mobility and strength, and to feel good in their body for longer. I saw this post that Billie made on Instagram recently, 4 diet culture messages in yoga and movement and how to reframe them, and I loved what they were saying. So I invited Billie to be on the podcast to talk further about this. In our conversation today, you're going to hear how Billie ended up doing work to combat diet culture messages and how they help people start checking in and listening to their bodies. We also talk about how we as yoga teachers can let go of control and empower our students to make the decisions that are best for them in the moment instead of trying to quote unquote micromanage them or feel hurt that our students are not following our lesson plans. Billie also shares some tips on how we can create more inclusive spaces. And I really love the reflections on how social justice ties in with yoga. I cannot wait for you to hear this episode, so I need to stop talking. Let's dive in and learn from Billie. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. Billie, it's great to have you back. I know the last time I didn't actually get to interview you, but we hosted one of your podcasts. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. It did kind of feel like, we've chatted about it before it was published, and then we chatted after. So it kind of felt like I was here, even though I wasn't actually here.
Yeah, you created some really powerful content, and I was just super grateful that you said yes to us sharing it on the podcast. I'll link to that one in the show notes in case our listeners didn't hear it. Before we dive into talking about how you make yoga more inclusive and how you make movement more accessible, tell us what's the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Yeah. So I teach movement and yoga classes primarily online currently. I started off just as just as a yoga teacher. It seems a bit of a weird way of explaining it, but I was, in a studio, and then started my business when the studio closed, pandemic happened. And as time went on, I kind of realized, this is the way that I want to teach. Some of the things that really resonated with me, and I kind of dropped some of the stuff that didn't. And so now it's kind of grown into me teaching primarily folks who are either interested in leaving diet culture or they've left diet culture entirely. I teach safe as a queer person, non-binary person classes. I do my best to be really cognizant and aware of trauma stuff as also a trauma survivor. And so I do one-on-one coaching as well, helping folks leave diet culture and helping to kind of pick out some of the stuff that diet culture has left behind, because we grew up in a society with so much of it, and it's not, unfortunately, as easy as just closing the door and leaving. There's all sorts of little, I was going to say, snippets or little bits of annoying things that stick around. So that's the long but short version.
Thank you so much. The metaphor of when you're walking through a field, you and I both do this out on our walks, and those little burrs from different plants stick to you. I feel like that's how diet culture is.
That's totally true. Yeah, that's a really good one. I really like that one because sometimes you don't see them and you don't notice them for a little bit. I also sometimes use the analogy tree roots, really, really deep, really intricate. and you think you can pull out like the main plant. I don't know if anyone could pull out a tree with their bare hands, but you know what I mean. And then you try to like plant new stuff in it, but not all the roots are gone. So you have to go through and you have to like take all the roots out, and it's this really annoying, difficult process, but ends up being, I don't know, having space for more better stuff in your head.
So true. We have a bunch of podcasts that I will link to if people are like, but wait, where is the harm in talking about getting quote unquote healthy, and how when we start talking about food and diet, I'll make sure that we link to those as well. And I'm so excited that you are doing this work, uh, really talking about it, because I feel like sometimes I look out into the broad sea of yoga and there are way too many messages that are like about releasing toxins or, um, oh, there was a really harmful one that I shared with you this year that,
Oh
Diane Bondi
yeah.
created that reel. What was the wording on it? It was like, "Lose your belly fat," or something, or
Yeah.
"Don't eat the cake." I forget. It was, like, super harmful. Detoxing. Detoxing.
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
the word.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this work,
Oh,
because
thanks.
it's there's too much.
Mhm.
Diet culture still stuck in the yoga world, like those pesky roots. Okay, so let's start with, like, what led you to this journey? What led you to making sure that your yoga spaces are inclusive?
Um, when I first started practicing yoga, well, maybe not first, but early on when I was just practicing yoga, I wasn't teaching. I had quite a lot of experiences in studios where I was kind of made, like looking at it now, I can see that I was kind of made to believe that my body was the problem, not that maybe a different alignment of the posture would have been a better idea, or that I should listen to my body when I need rest rather than pushing into a back bend that the teacher said it would be good for me. There's so many messages that the teacher knew everything, somehow knew everything about my body, my history, and knew what was best for me in the practice. And it didn't really leave me feeling very good about my body or about the practice. And quite a few times I just wanted to quit despite the roots of yoga, like the roots of my relationship with yoga, and the what I experienced in it was very helpful for my mental health, just helped me feel more in my body. And then as I began to start to teach, I in a couple of my teacher trainings, I had some really cool teachers that were very, I don't know if against the grain or a little bit of a different vibe than some of the other teachers that got really specific in saying like there's actually not one version of a posture that's going to work for everybody, and here are the reasons why, and actually this is fine, and actually, there's like all this stuff that felt like it blew my mind. And every single time I went to this teacher in a couple of different trainings, felt like I learned more and more and more about how we think we know all this stuff. Even from like my first training to my third training, everything changed. And when kind of got to see from that perspective, and then kind of bringing it into classes, how changing your perspective on postures as not being a very like black and white thing, it's not one particular alignment, can not only completely change the student's practice, but it can also change their whole relationship to their practice or their body. Like they leave the room not feeling like their body is the problem, which I think just should, I wish was the norm. I hope one day will be the norm. And it, I don't know, I just felt like as the more I learned, the more I didn't want to go back to teaching in ways that that I learned were um, not feeling very inclusive. I think I remember the quote you just said before we started recording about you, you only know so much. You can't know everything, but that you do what you can with what you know. And the other one is like the more you know, the more you can do better or something. I mean, I'm not getting any of these quotes right, but hopefully the messaging is right. That I think that as people and as teachers, we should always be trying to learn more about how we can be inclusive to a bunch of, not just like in one area, but in many areas, and starting to learn about the ways to do that it's so easy. It's not a hard switch, and I just don't see any point in not doing it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes such sense. And as you're saying this, like, I'm thinking of when I was leaving my very first 200-hour yoga teacher training. I remember thinking, gosh, I need to learn more about teaching to a pregnant body because I don't know
Yeah.
enough. So I needed to make my classes better for a pregnant body. Not that the pregnant body was the problem, although it kind of felt
Mhm.
like that at first. It felt like I don't have the skills. And so maybe I'll just put you in child's pose for the whole class. And that's not really the solution. So it was up to me to do the learning. And now, like, there's so many other, well, I have my students to thank for that, where it was like, oh, this is showing up, like someone with knee surgery, someone with difficulty hearing me,
Mhm.
someone with a brain injury, someone who their nervous system was really like someone who dealt with a lot of trauma. And I love how you also make your yoga spaces online or in person more accessible to people who, like, to the queer community. I think it's amazing if someone can feel like, okay, that is a yoga space where I know I'm going to show up and be safe. And then
Mhm.
it keeps expanding out. Now we can't know everything. I love how you brought that back in, that we could be teaching a class and we say something and it's upsetting to someone. It could be triggering. Um, let's talk about the movement for a moment because you talked about
Mhm.
poses, and I love how you said that you went to some classes and you felt like your body was the problem. Like, I never want anyone to think that.
Mhm.
And I also don't want someone, how do we think it makes sense that a teacher knows more about your body than your own, like, I live in this
Yeah.
swimsuit. Like, how could someone else know what you need?
Exactly. And I don't know that it's necessarily like, I don't know if I obviously can't say for sure. I haven't had this type of conversation with every teacher I've ever met, but I don't know if I've met a teacher who explicitly has expressed that opinion that they know more about other people's bodies. But I do remember being a student and having students who have come to me with that sort of like the beginning of the conversation, like, you'll know better than me. And then I usually go back to like, but how does it feel though? Because like, I don't know how it feels. So I think, I mean, there probably are because there has been teachers that I've taught from, or not taught from, practice. They taught me. So I'm trying to say that kind of had that approach, and even when I was a teacher, they had that kind of approach, and I was like, I don't think like one person. I can't remember if it was like a flying pigeon or something. Which I can't do. I'm just going to say that right now. I don't really have any desire to do it. Maybe one day, but anyway, flying pigeon. And my arms are short, first of all. I have a bit of a bigger chest, and it's just without having blocks, I don't think it's just ever gonna work for me because my shins are long, arms are short, whatever. And in case you don't know, it's like it's this really impossible feeling thing where you twist, your elbows are on the outside of the opposite, like both my elbows say on the outside of my right leg, and then you bring all of your weight into your hands, and then you just lift the rest of your body up. And not saying that people who have short arms and like bigger chest can't do the posture, but you probably might have to use blocks if you have short arms like I do. You might have to adjust where your arms are. It's not my body that was the problem. It was their approach to teaching it. That I know that's kind of an extreme version example, but there's so many ways of adjusting how we approach postures that's not blaming the body for things that the body didn't do wrong.
Yes. Oh my gosh, it's so true. I love when teachers, you know, really look at what is the goal of this pose? Because I'd be
Mhm.
asking, like, what's the goal of flying pigeon? Is it just we just want to look really cool?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that's your goal and you're like, I actually love the way this feels in my body for some reason, then cool. I would say, like, there are ways to build this up, or maybe you find other poses that feel sort of the same way. But over the years, I've learned, like, the the alignment that I was taught in many poses, the picture of the pose in the book or in the magazine, um, a lot of it doesn't really feel like yoga
Mhm.
to me anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Like, it's like,
And I
what's
think
the point of this?
exactly. I think that's a good thing to ask and a good thing to reflect on because um, we don't always when we're teaching, we might not necessarily have the space unless it's a one-on-one to, like, have this conversation with everybody in the room, every person in the room, but I feel like if you just I say just like it's easy, but if you give a couple, like 2 even neutral options, and have there be some sort of thing at the beginning, whatever, where that they can do whatever they need to do and then stick by that, not like only ever praising the people doing the most, like, in quotes, like fancy version of the posture, the most difficult version of the posture, like, because then you're saying one thing and then actually it means something else because you're not following through with your values from the beginning. But if you can kind of keep that atmosphere of it really does not matter what you do. If you need to lay down the whole time, if you want to do a different posture, if you want to do your own thing, then if you give 2 options, someone maybe eventually, maybe not the first class, because it can be kind of an awkward thing for them to check in with, but maybe a couple classes in can actually have the space to think like, what do I want from this right now? Is this going to feel good? If did you have like a reaction in your body where your whole body tensed up at the idea of doing one of these postures, like maybe that's not for you today. That's fine.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, two points are coming up in my brain. Sometimes it's a little hard, so I hope I remember them both. One is now I'm gonna forget them both. Okay, one, I wanna come back to when you talked about a student kind of approaching a teacher in that moment where they actually do
Mm,
think that the teacher knows more. So that does
mhm,
happen. I wanna
mhm.
come back to call that out
Okay.
because what a gift when we as teachers turn it around and ask them more questions, ask them to find that inquiry in their bodies.
Mhm.
Can you talk about why that's such a gift?
The first is that disrupting this idea that there's a hierarchy, that this teacher is somehow more of an expert or more like they have their life figured out or like there's some magical thing. Like they're just a human being.
Right.
And also that it's giving the student, the person asking the questions, autonomy over their own body. Um, that is a very important step that not a lot of people necessarily have the space to have. Like some people never have that in their life until this class or until this conversation where they've never really thought, oh, it actually doesn't matter what this teacher thinks of this posture. It matters how it feels for me. So if you can go in and say for example, one common one I think was like, oh, am I doing this right? Because they're like, depends. How does it feel for you? And if they're like, oh, this my knee feels really awful, then you're like, okay, how does it feel if you like scoot your foot over or whatever? It depends on the posture, but if you think of it more of as like a experiment, it's giving the student the power to make the choices but what feels best. It's sending the message that there's nothing wrong with their body and it's also not a big deal. Like if the posture is not fitting and they need to scooch their feet a little bit and then it fits better, it's I guess it's more than 2 points. But the still the same message that there's not one way of doing things, that there's many different approaches that are valid.
I love that you brought up the autonomy and like deciding in that moment, what do I actually need as a student? I know that you and I have had side conversations about like working with people who are trauma survivors. And I know you and I both have experience in working with those people. And I feel like that's one of the most powerful gifts that you can give in a yoga practice. Typically, I find that those people will be saying, like, where should I feel this? Or like, is this right? Or am I doing it right? Or checking in and to really
Mhm,
come back to them feeling it and making that decision and being able to say, actually, no, I don't want to do that one. And having choices in that class can be super powerful. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that it could be a big conversation in itself, but I think that it also, actually, I do have one thing to add, is that it also gives you, the student, the opportunity, I got the word stuck in my head, to learn a little bit more about themselves, because rather than just hearing or seeing, okay, I put my foot here, and then this is it. Think like listening to their body, or like checking in, how does it feel? How do my hips feel? Maybe they can then, recognize, oh, I always favor my right foot. Interesting. And then, just learning from it, learning and having a bit of a deeper connection to your body too, which I think is important, especially as folks who've mostly or have often been told to not listen to their body from diet culture, or the many, many other reasons that we may have gotten that message.
Okay, the second part that I did remember is when you were talking about, um, the freedom that a student will feel if they're like, "Yeah, actually, I don't like this pose," and then they do something different. Now, I remember back when I was a newer yoga teacher, I used to get this weird, I don't know what it came from, like joy. I think it's weird now, of looking out of a at a group class of people and seeing them all sort of look the same,
Hmm.
and just thinking, "Gosh, that's beautiful." And then to learn over the years of, like, actually what's beautiful is looking out and seeing everyone doing something different
Hmm.
and letting go. I think it for me, I think it was like, I mean, it was what I was taught, and then I think it's also a control thing of letting go of this control, like, and so a common question that comes up in our Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group is someone's like, I was leading this thing in this class, and then this person over here is just never doing what I'm leading. What would you say to that teacher?
It's interesting because my experience over, like, as I've been teaching, has also shifted a lot. When I first started, um, in like 2016, I as a new teacher, I don't know if it was something that was, you know, in um inadvertently taught to me or something, but there was this idea that it was like personal. That it was like my fault as a teacher, and it was something bad that I like hated my classes. Um Particularly if the person doing a different thing was a teacher, then it was like, oh no, I'll like, this is the worst. I'm doing the worst job. And I know that I'm not the only one that has this experience. I did do some like, is this something that I should be, I should work on? Which yes, and also it was, I think, something that was taught to me, and just all to do with the environment of the studio, which is a whole other conversation. But now I don't know what happened. At what I guess it was all the other changing that happened, but I would kindly like and compassionately remind you. I don't mean this is going to sound like harsh wording, but I mean it in the most loving way, is that it's probably nothing to do with you. It's like not about you at all. And I mean that like, you're doing a great job, everything is fine. Keep your, do be open for feedback. If the person was like, you said this and it was a triggering thing, or I hurt my foot because of this thing or whatever, like do be open to that, but also it's probably nothing to do with you. In my I would say if you're in a studio, like an actual um in person space, and someone's doing something that doesn't look like it's safe to the people around them, like they're really unsteadily going into handstands, in that case, I would maybe have a conversation with that student one on one, and just say, totally love and support your practice. Can you maybe stay, like, wait till everyone's out of the room, and if you're open to staying at the studio an extra 5 minutes or whatever, or just kind of let them know that, like, you're not shaming them. I wouldn't call them out in front of the whole class, but just in a safe way, being like, love that you're doing your own thing. Can we keep it to things that aren't going to like accidentally kick your neighbor in the face? Or yeah, that kind of thing, especially if it's like in a hot yoga space where it's just like, things could happen here. But I would take a little step back if it's something that seems like it could cause harm, or I'm I don't think that I can't think of any other examples. Then you could have a conversation with a student. If you're noticing, if you say like, hey, I noticed that you always take this posture this way. Just wondering like why. And then maybe they say, oh, I had a knee surgery and this is why. Or maybe they say, I don't know, this is how I thought your posture is supposed to go.
Right.
There's many, many different scenarios, but I would do your best. Don't take it personally. It's nothing to do with you. It has probably nothing to do with how good of a teacher you are, and everything to do with that person's body, the person's day, the person's life. And you probably don't have to worry about it, I guess, again, unless the previous things we talked about are the case.
It's a safety thing.
Yeah.
I fully agree. And I think one way you can kind of build this with your students too is you can, give them a few variations in a pose, or like try moving your arms in this way and try this way and then see which one you like better, because sometimes people have never been to a class where they're invited to do something different or to choose or even think about it. So sometimes I've had moments, if I just call it like, okay, for the next 5 minutes, it's just going to be free flow yoga. They'll be looking at me and looking around. And there's this moment of confusion, like, I don't know how to move unless you're guiding me. So I would build it up in classes as well. I think that's a really beautiful thing. And check in with yourself, a little like self-study. Why is it that I want everyone to look the same in this class?
I think that's important because sometimes maybe it is something to do with a message you were taught. Maybe it's like you're feeling a bit insecure. I think also is when you're a new teacher, it also makes sense to be nervous that you're doing something wrong anytime you're starting anything new. But just keep doing your best. And I wish someone had told me this when it was like everything's fine. It's not a big deal. Again, unless you think they're going to kick someone in the face accidentally, then serious, but.
Connected yoga teachers, I'm popping in here for a moment to say a huge thank you to the team over at OfferingTree, not only for creating the software that I use and love all the time in my own business, but also for really showing up to foster community that is focused around collective care. So not that long ago, Sinead, who works on our team, but also works with the team over at OfferingTree, Sinead O'Connor, not the singer, Sinead reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, we just had this idea over at OfferingTree of how we're going to do this collaboration, or we're inviting you to do this collaboration with you and with Billie and OfferingTree. And I love when opportunities come up like this, because it just benefits everyone, and especially benefits our connected yoga teacher listeners, the OfferingTree users, the people who want to make yoga more inclusive and anti-diet. I'm super excited about this. So this is coming in December. I will be talking about it more on the podcast with dates and details. But right now, I just want to say thank you to OfferingTree, because they sponsor the podcast, but they also are always asking themselves, how can we form connections with other podcasters, other yoga teachers, and how can we bring this all together to benefit our users? It's an amazing thing to watch. It's not something that every company does. I have to say that. And the fact that they are willing to look at issues like making yoga inclusive, talking about anti-diet work in yoga spaces, this is a company that I want to be connected to. So if you're feeling like, yeah, I'm looking for a booking software or a way to take payments or help with my website or a way to simplify everything, check out OfferingTree, and we have a discount code for you. That's over at OfferingTree.com/Shannon. Alrighty, let's get back into this conversation with Billie and I. What about when we don't have the lived experience and we still want to make our classes more inclusive and accessible? Like, let's say we don't live in a bigger body. We aren't part of the queer community. How do we let people know, hey, this is an inclusive space for you to come to?
I would say the thing that's going to make the most impact is the actions rather than the words. So part of the thing I think is tricky is that people want like the stamp of approval or like the gold stamp, like the rainbow flag they can put in their window and say it's inclusive, but then you walk in and it's not. I would There's like, if you live in Canada, there's rainbow registration, which is a thing you could do that I've just, completed. There's they have lots of resources. There's queer teachers who put on workshops. I've done workshops before who talk about how to make, some things like to start you off, how to make things a little bit more inclusive. I would learn from people who do have lived experience. Check in with your if you use social media, check in with who you follow. Do you only follow non-queer people? Maybe broaden that. There's tons of amazing creators who are talking about ways to make things more inclusive, or just like listen to your students first. Like if you're in a space where you do like, what are the feedback forums or something like that? Some studios send them out every year or whatever. Have a space on there where like, is there anything that you want to put forward, and have it be a space where it's actually safe for them to give feedback, where you're not then getting defensive and saying like, oh, these are all the reasons I'm being inclusive and you're wrong. So like, okay, thank you so much for the feedback. And then if something's wrong, follow up with them and then continue the conversation. Similar thing with teaching people with bigger bodies is learn from people who have bigger bodies. Don't make assumptions on what people can and can't do, because that's going to just cause harm. It already does cause a lot of harm. Learn from people who are in bigger bodies. There's tons of amazing books out there learning about why diet culture is based on lies and how it causes harm. And that's kind of a big thing to say, just drop out there. So I don't mean to just like drop things and leave it. Like people like Aubrey Gordon, Maintenance Phase. There's so many books where if you're actually part of it is, I'll try to say it in a little bit of a clearer way. Learn from people who do have lived experience. Do your best to have open conversations with people who are in your community about how you could do better. Don't just put a rainbow flag or whatever on the window or post a picture of a person in a larger body and say you're inclusive, because that's not inclusive. And not that you can't put the rainbow flag, but you have to actually do other things too. That if you focus on learning from folks and doing your best to, what is the word? To unlearn your implicit bias, where you're like, what judgment is coming up for me when there's queer people in my space, or for me when there's people with larger bodies in my space? Because if you don't feel like a safe person for them, your space probably won't either. And I would say start there. Keep learning, because it's not going to be something where you just take one like hour-long course and then you're suddenly an inclusive person, because it's a longer process. And I will say one more thing on that is that, again, try to depersonalize it a little bit. When I say that, I mean, if someone's giving you feedback or you're learning something, say in a course or from a person who's in a different body from you, you learn something that you have done wrong, that the message is not you are a bad person. The message is, this is how you could do better. And I think sometimes we get a little stuck. We have a hard time getting feedback or being open to feedback when we think that it feels like we're doing something horrible. Like we can get a little bit stuck in our own head with this stuff. And I get that. It's fine to have your feelings about it, but have your feelings about it outside of that space, not with those people. With trusted family, friends, whatever, or therapist. But that's just another thing that does come up a lot anytime you're doing any work on learning your implicit bias, is that we can get a little bit stuck in like, oh no, like I've said this thing, I messed up, like I'm the worst. Like we're just getting a little in your own head. Take a little time, feel your feelings, and then come back to it knowing that you are not, you are part of a larger system, and the system is the problem. That's why we're doing this work. Long answer. Sorry if that was too long, but I feel like that part needed to be said.
That was a brilliant answer. I'm here for it. I love this. That again, we're not blaming like the teacher. It started off that we weren't blaming the body that we're coming to class in.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're not blaming like when we've lived in the system and here's how we've learned. I've been doing that publicly on the podcast because I've said many things where I'm like, ooh, like sometimes I could recognize it when someone came forward and said, Shannon, this was harmful. And other times I
Mm-hmm.
got really defensive and was like, no, I'm done. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to learn anymore. And I did. And I now it's a little easier to be like, oh yeah, I messed up. I did that thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have a great episode that links to many other episodes of how to make your yoga classes more gender inclusive, um, or more inclusive for people of, you know, that identify as queer, trans, all the things. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's the Beyond Pronouns and Pride Month or something. It's called something like that. And we link to also some training that you can do because this is something that I saw in my experience as a pelvic health professional that like we could take gender out of this language most of the time. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally.
And it's there for us yoga teachers. Diane Bondi is someone who also we've had on the podcast. I'll link to some other ones that we've done basically on this work of like anti-oppression. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's our like little label that we put on those episodes.
Yeah.
Speaking of this, I want to ask you a question out of the blue kind of about this because we had a yoga teacher reach out who's in a yoga teacher training. I talked about this in another podcast and I want to get your thoughts on this. They're sitting in this yoga teacher training and one of the lead teachers said anything that has to do with social justice is out of your scope of practice as a yoga teacher. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I have mixed feelings. I think that it's absolutely something that is like social justice is a part of yoga. Um, if you're looking at yoga as more than just like physical movement practice, which it is, it's more than just a physical practice. I think if you're saying out of your scope of practice, unless you have you've done a ton of research and you have a huge background in politics, maybe you don't present yourself as the expert. Like you are a yoga teacher, you teach yoga practices. You don't have to present yourself as an expert. However, I think that it's I don't know if the word I mean to say is like unjust, but it's um taking social justice out of practice is part of the thing that's causing harm. It's like if you ignore it, it doesn't stop existing. Like if you ignore the fact that oppression exists, it doesn't stop existing. And likely if you're not in some form doing your best to um be you don't necessarily have to be super up to date, but then you can't talk about like up to date events. But how am I trying to say this? I feel like there's so many feelings and thoughts that they're hard to like. I'm also baffled that someone would say that in the first place. But like, don't just present yourself as an expert without doing any actual work or doing any actual research. And I mean, even then, I still feel like you don't have to be an expert, but you can have an opinion and you can think that people deserve to be allowed to exist and be allowed like to have value. And if you want people to feel safe in your class, that includes doing that, like doing some social justice work, whether it's unlearning your internal bias, whether it's learning from people who have different backgrounds than you or look different from you or have different from beliefs from you. um, I don't think we can have a fair, helpful practice without with leaving social justice off the table entirely. Like, social justice, like, I think we talked about this. Was it on my podcast? Where so the word, like the term social justice is like, you might be like, oh no, like that's a big term. Like that's a big thing. I don't know if I do that. Like, but if you care about people, if you think that trans people deserve to exist, if people in large bodies deserve to exist, if BIPOC folks, Indigenous folks deserve to exist without being worried for their life, then you believe in social justice. And that should, I would think, be a part of the yoga practice. Like I lost part of my train of thought at the end there, but did that come out?
Yes, it came out really
Okay.
well. I also appreciate that you said, like, okay, if you're not up to date and you feel like you need more information. I appreciate that side of things. I get that. I think that might be where this is coming from. Is a fear of like, I don't know if I can hold space for this, or I don't know if I know enough. I don't know if this is my lane. And there are yoga teachers out there like yourself who are like, this is my lane. If you want to like call out diet culture or like not have it exist in your class, and you want to take a class that's super inclusive and invites you to connect with your own inner wisdom and not like, oh, I know more than you. There's no weird power dynamic. Then a yoga class with you is what people are looking for. How do people find you? How do they practice with you or learn from you?
So my website is Move with Billie, BILLIE. It's not with a Y, .com. And primarily right now, it's all online. I have group classes. The membership is Rebel Movement Club. And those are, you can do live classes or the recorded classes. I also do one-on-ones. Whether you're a teacher and you want to know, pick apart a little bit of how to be more inclusive, or you want to figure out how diet culture is affecting your movement practice. Or some folks come with very specific body things where they're like, my hips feel weird every time I do this posture, or whatever. I do also I forgot what they're called. Like someone will hire me to do a workshop for a group. I think there's a better way of explaining that, but I do also do that. And if you just email me, it's info@movewithbillie, or if you go to movewithbillie.com, it should be pretty obvious in several places how to contact me. And I think there's a consult, one-on-one or consult page. I can't even remember. It's my own website, and I'm the one that built it, but movewithbillie.com is the place to go. And then you can always email me if you can't find what you're looking for.
Okay. I have to say your website's great. Oh, you also have a podcast.
Oh,
You
I do. Yeah.
also are a fellow OfferingTree user as well.
Yeah, I am. Yeah. Yeah. My podcast is Rebel Movement Podcast. And yeah, my website's all through OfferingTree. I was really excited when I found that they had like the on-demand capabilities and everything. So I felt a little bit like stuck on how on earth to how to do this all online. And it was nice to find a space that was actually putting that together.
Yeah. Okay. That's fantastic. I'll make sure to link to those in the show notes. And I would also say to our listeners, if you're thinking like, gosh, how can I learn to teach more inclusive? Like taking classes from people like Billie is a great way to do it, because you'll just be like, oh, I love that language. Like I remember being in a class where the teacher was like, how does this feel in your body? And then let's try something like this. And like that invitational language, I remember when that was added instead of, here's how it will be, hold your arms like this and take 5 breaths. Very different style of teaching.
Yeah, that's so true. It's a really good way of learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in this world. And thanks for spending some time here hanging out with all of us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was very fun.
Oh my goodness, connected yoga teachers. I want to hear from you. What are your key takeaways in this conversation? What things really stuck with you? What things came up where you're like, oh gosh, I could learn from that? Or like, oh yeah, I am so glad that I've learned that in these spaces. Or maybe there's something that we missed. Maybe there's something that as we were talking, you were like, oh, wait, there's this other thing. We would love to hear that. You can leave a comment or you can leave a voice message. So to leave a comment, head on over to our website, go to theconnectedyogateacher.com/381 or post it in our Facebook group. You can find that by going to our homepage, theconnectedyogateacher.com, and you'll see how to join the Facebook group. There's like tens of thousands of global yoga teachers in that group. Super supportive group. Or you can leave us a voice message, which I love, love, love. There's a button on our website and you can leave a voice message and you can say, this is just for Shannon, or yeah, you can play this on the podcast and tell us, what you thought of this episode today. I will also include all of the links to Billie's work that they are doing. I highly recommend following them on Instagram. Oh my gosh, I got the biggest laugh the other day when Billie was out in their garden and also like laughing at their own way that they'd put their hair up and at the same time talking about something really serious. And I just appreciate that as humans, we have all of this stuff going on at the same time and Billie makes space for it. And I just feel like really safe when I chat with them and really cared for. And I learn a lot from Billie. So I hope you connect with them and laugh. We can laugh together. Billie usually shares funny things every Wednesday on Instagram, and I appreciate that. I hope they appreciate that I'm like, here are all the funny things I found this week. Oh my gosh, we all need that as well mixed in. The next thing that's sort of coming up, let's talk about next podcast episode. So I want to say that this is one of those episodes where I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to pull this together? What's this going to look like? I have like some anxiety about this episode. And as I'm listening to the audio, because I've been doing that this week, getting it ready for all of you, I am so grateful that this is coming to you when it is. So next time on the podcast, that's October the 7th, it will release. I'll be chatting with Rebecca Sebastian, and it's kind of one of those like private conversations, but we're going to share it on the podcast. And Rebecca actually, I believe, is sharing it a week sooner. So if you want to head on over to Rebecca's podcast, you can listen to our conversation and then you could come back on October the 7th and hear my thoughts, like the intro and the outro and my thoughts on this. It's one of those episodes, Connected Yoga Teachers, where I'm like, I went to put it together. I shuffled it around because I knew it needed to go out sooner because it's a really important conversation right now. I know a lot of people are talking to me that they're having tough conversations in their world and they want to figure this out together. And this conversation is meant to do that. I also want to tell you one other thing about it. Rebecca's the one that had this idea that we bring this to the podcast. Rebecca and I had a tough conversation as friends. We had a disagreement late 2023, and then we just sort of left it and stopped talking, which isn't really like us. And then we both, had a conversation and then decided to bring parts of that conversation onto the podcast. So it's a real look at like two friends trying to figure it out and then also talking about how this is part of yoga, how we need to be looking at tough conversations like this in the yoga world. I'm so grateful for Rebecca on this because, she's just one of those friends who's like, let's dive in and do this. This will be useful as a podcast episode. It was her idea, and I'm super grateful for her. And I'm excited for you to listen to it as well. And when I put it on the calendar, I have to tell you, the moment I realized that it was going out on October the 7th, I was like, whoa. For the people living in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, since October the 7th, this entire year for them has been something that I can't even fathom, but that we are all watching through the news or on our phones. And there are a lot of tough conversations to have right now as we're witnessing what is a genocide. And I just appreciate that Rebecca was willing to have this conversation with me because I was feeling some pretty big feelings and questions, and she was just super open and honest. And I know that we're both, fighting for collective care, collective liberation, and that's the common ground that we have. So have a listen in a couple of weeks. And thanks for being here also, like listening into this, learning as I learn. It means so much. I also want to say that I couldn't do this alone. The team over here, Suzanne, who does the audio, Crunch, who does the show notes and is this traveling writer, Sinead, who really supports our community and takes care of so many behind the scenes things. Oh my gosh, these humans make this podcast possible, along with our sponsor, OfferingTree. And most of all, you, dear listener. You make this podcast possible. You're listening here all the way until the end. I have no script in front of me at this point, no reading, just make sure you end the podcast soon, Shannon. I appreciate that you're here right until the end and that we've hung out learning from Billie today about how to make yoga more inclusive. I've been thinking about how we can be more connected online or in person. How can I hear from more connected yoga teachers? You can definitely jump on our email list and then reply to emails or leave me a voice message or tag me on social media. I seriously love to hear from podcast listeners. You can leave us a review. That's a fun thing to do. We love that as well because it helps share it with other people. And most of all, I just really want to hear from you what would support you right now. What questions do you have? What struggles are you having as a yoga teacher? Yeah, how can we support you is what's on my mind each and every time I hit record. And also, as I end this episode, I'm going to leave you with a question. What will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?